Hello everyone, it's April 2nd, 2019. It's Tuesday, it's Harp Tuesday. Welcome to this edition of Harp Tuesday. And today I'm just gonna blurb along a little bit about fingering and trusting your hands or not trusting your hands. So if you get nothing else out of this video, I want to bring to your attention this lovely little piece called Petite Berceuse by Hasselmans. It's freely available on the Harp archives, so there's a link in the video description below. Harp Column, I believe, featured this in their 30-day challenge in January. It's a piece that has no lever changes or pedal changes, no accidentals, key of C, lowest note is this C below middle C, so eminently playable on most harps, and it's a lovely little piece. And it has a fingering spot in there that kind of got me thinking about this episode. I was also inspired by some of the episodes I've done on problem solving. I think in the episode that I did on this little section in the prelude from Debussy's Suite Bergamasque, I talked about how I was spurred to problem solve that little section because it didn't feel as good as I wanted it to. And that comes from having played, I think, for so many years that I really have a sense of, I can really trust my hands in terms of knowing is something feeling as good as it should, given sort of the technical challenges surrounding that. And I don't think I went into detail in that video about okay, well, yes, I'm talking about trusting my hands, but is that something you should always do? And so here I wanted to talk a little bit more about that and just sort of about fingerings in general and how fingerings kind of fall into a range of different meanings to them, as it were. And there was actually a recent comment on a Facebook group as well that really tied into what I was thinking about and kind of spurred me on as well to do this episode. So, and in terms of trusting your hands, I think it kind of, again, falls on a continuum where the longer that you've played, and not necessarily tied to the level that you've achieved, but just the longer that you've played, the more comfortable you will be with your own technique and your hands, and the more, again, you kind of know, oh, this feels comfortable or this doesn't. And if you've been playing 20 years and this section that looks like it should be easy or should feel comfortable to you, but isn't, that's a great sign that there must be something you could do in terms of fingering, in terms of problem solving it to make it feel better. But on the other extreme, if you're completely new to the harp, chances are everything feels strange and peculiar and awkward. And so to try to rely on the response of your hands or arm or body in terms of figuring out what is the proper way to finger something or to play or whatever, it's not a reliable guide. And in fact, so a classic example, right, of something that when you're with people who are starting, they often struggle with pre-placing, right? That idea of placing notes, connecting, and that it can feel easier to kind of wander down one string at a time. And it's understandable, right? Because it feels easier because it is easier because you're having to read this next note, oh, and what's the next one, and what's the next one, and the next one. To try and read the 3 notes ahead that you would need in order to find all 3 of these at once, that's a lot of extra mental effort. And yet, if we think about it, in the end, the mental effort will go away, right? Because we maybe start to memorize the piece, we start to be more familiar with reading notes on the page or learning notes or whatever. But the physical challenge of trying to reduce the effort that we make as much as possible, that it takes just as much physical effort and time to find this single note as it does to find all 3 of these, or basically the same, so that in order to play quickly, we want to do that pre-placement. And again, there's no way if we didn't place that we could achieve the speed we can by pre-placing. So that's an example where, in fact, our hand's responses, or our body or our mind's responses, will lead us astray, where we can't rely on that. So again, I think the longer that we've been playing, the more we can kind of rely on our hands, and the newer we are to the harp, the more we have to rely on a good teacher or a book with good fingerings. And that's, for example, that's why I like the Betty Prey first harp book, even though maybe it's a little bit dated, but the fingerings are excellent. Because if you're not working with a teacher, all you have to go on is whatever music and books you're working from, and you're at the mercy of those fingerings. And again, not all fingerings, from my point of view, not all fingerings are great. Some, we'll talk more about that. Sometimes it's just options, but sometimes there are maybe bad fingerings that actually do tie your fingers up a little bit and cause you make things harder than they need to be. So, and how do we figure that out, right? I'll talk a little bit about that. And so we can't necessarily trust our fingers in the beginning. And the other thing about fingerings is that they also fall on a bit of a curve. They go from maybe being, yes, this is absolutely the one and only fingering you should use here, to a spot where, and I know as someone who publishes music, I like to include fingerings because I feel that if you need them, you really need them. Whereas if you don't need them, you can always just ignore whatever I put down there. So there will be some spots where I feel really torn, where it's almost like a coin flip, where I feel that this fingering could work, but this fingering could also work, maybe equally as well, or maybe almost as well. And so you never know when you're reading someone else's fingerings whether that spot is one where they felt, yes, this is absolutely the best fingering, or where it's, yeah, this is a good fingering, this works, but there's another fingering that will work just as well. So a classic example, right, would be, say you're doing 5 notes in a row going up. Would you do 3, 2, 1, 2, 1? That would be the most typical. But maybe you prefer to cross under with 3. That might depend on your size of your hands, the size of your fingers, the harp that you're playing, the music, the context. And again, I think either one is a fine fingering, right? So then, in terms of fingering, and I'll talk about petite pursuits in a moment. When we look at fingering, sometimes we'll come across something that startles us, and in a way that can be kind of cool. I remember my teacher would talk about Grangini. I think of the Grangini, the Bach etudes that he did, and other stuff as well. How oftentimes his fingering wasn't what you expected, but it almost always worked, and just kind of neat that way, right? How it's fun to come across some fingering that you maybe wouldn't have expected, and then does feel comfortable, and you go, oh yes, this is a great fingering, and that just expands your repertoire. So in my arrangement of the Bach Gavotte, there's a spot where I have 5 notes going up, and because of what's happening next, because that D is getting played right away, I can't remember the next note, but anyway, I ended up doing 4, 3, 2, 1, 2, right? Not a fingering you would expect. Again, 3, 2, 1, 2, 1, or 3, 2, 1, 3, 1. Hey, if you like slides, 4, 4, 3, 2, 1. But it works in that context, and so that's kind of neat. If you come across that and you're like, oh, hey, let me try that, and it feels okay, then it just becomes something to be aware of, to add to your tool of tricks. Bag of tricks. Bag of tools? To add to your tool bag. In the Petite Berceuse, there's a spot on the second page where the fingering is, we find all 4 strings, B through E, we play 1 and 4 together, there's a chord. What is it? And then 2 and 3. And that's actually a great fingering, because if we play this chord and then had to find these, that slows us down, and there's a chance of buzzing as well. Whereas if we can find all 4 of them, that idea of pre-placement, that's great. And it might be that you've never encountered that, and so that's, again, a great spot to say, oh, cool, interesting. It's also an example of sometimes you come across a fingering where it's maybe a good fingering, but it requires maybe your technique to get a little bit better than it currently is. So you might come there and find that trying to play 1 and 4 together is hard. As an aside, another reason I like the first Harp book is you've got some exercises on that exact thing in there, and it's an excellent thing to be able to do. And so could you rely on your fingers then to say, oh, wow, this feels really hard. I'm just gonna come off or do something else? Yes and no. If you so again, the longer that you've been playing, so if you feel that your technique is not going to get any better, then yes, and that this is always going to feel awkward, sure, maybe finding a different fingering. But in this case, it's worth trying it for a while at least, because if you can push your technique a little bit, or just get familiar with that feeling of playing 1 and 4 while 2 and 3 are on the string, it is an excellent fingering. So again, there's a case where we can't necessarily rely on how comfortable something feels for our hands, where it's a case of actually needing to push our technique a little bit. And I did that episode on the opening of the Handel Passacaglia, right? These, for my money, the playing 4-2, 3-1, and then 1-3, 2-4 is the best fingering, but it requires being able to do that, right? And that is potentially challenging, and you might come to that if you're haven't done that, and you come to that and you're like, oh, that just feels really awkward. Why would I do that? I'm going to do a different fingering. And yet it is, if you can do it, I think it is a fantastic fingering. So again, sometimes we come to a fingering that seems a little weird, and maybe it feels just fine, and we say, oh wow, cool, I never would have expected that, but it actually works really well. Sometimes we come to a fingering and it feels awkward, right? And there we somehow have to determine, is this awkward because it's a bad fingering, or is this awkward because it requires me to push my technique? And also, sometimes we come to a fingering and it's awkward, and maybe it's not a bad fingering per se, but maybe it's just not a great fingering for us. Again, sometimes there are cases where a fingering might be, this is absolutely the best way to do it, but sometimes it's just based on, for example, the size of your hand, right? The type of fingering that you want to do might vary. And so the example on Facebook, the question was, in the Renier transcription of the first arabesque, the Debussy first arabesque, the left hand, she has it doing 4, 3, 2, 1, cross under to 3, if you can see. 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 1, 3. Again, something, for me at least, I wouldn't encounter that. I wouldn't necessarily think of doing that. A bit of a peculiar fingering. I learned it that way, and for me it works. I'm happy doing it that way. But I feel that first of all, it's kind of one of those 50-50 ones where, okay, that it works, and maybe I do kind of like how it how it lines up with what the right hand's doing. not enough to say that, oh yes, it's absolutely the best fingering. It works partly because my hands and fingers are so long that it's no problem doing this 1, 5, 8, 10 here, and this feels great. I've worked with students with much smaller hands where 4 2 1 2 1 or 4 2 1 3 1 have been much easier options for them, and that's a case where, for my money, I would trust my hands. Again, partly if you're playing this music, you've probably played for a reasonable amount of time, and again, you can start to maybe rely on how your hands feel. So that can be a tricky thing to determine, right? When you come across a fingering that feels a little bit awkward, is this one you should push against? Try and build your technique so you can master this fingering. Is this a fingering where there's an option that would be better for you available? Or is this just a bad fingering and you should absolutely look for a new fingering? And it's hard to know, right? That's where working with a good teacher, working with music. So again, you can also sometimes rely on the music, that if it's a book where in general you like the fingering, then you're maybe more inclined to trust that a particular fingering is something where you just have to push your technique and it's not a bad fingering. But again, like Layne, fantastic harpist composer, right? Worth trying that. And it's an interesting, again, if it works for you, it's an interesting little option to be aware of, that is a possibility for that. But again, always being aware that even with someone who gives you excellent fingerings, it might be, first of all, that they were that coin flip. They were like, oh, what should I do? Well, I'm going to do this. And also, everyone's hands are not the same. And it might be that for your hands and for your current technique, but also for just your hands in general and your body in general, a particular finger might or might not work. You can also, of course, check out YouTube and watch how people play a piece. Like if it's a popular piece, it can be interesting to see some of the fingerings that people use. And so finally, and thanks for listening to me blurble away here. Finally, I guess I would say that as important as fingerings are, I wouldn't get too worried about finding the best fingering, especially when you're new. That as long as you're learning reasonably good technique, you can always adjust fingerings, right? That yes, they help a lot, and they can sometimes make a huge difference in the ability to play a particular piece. But in terms of your overall skills of the harp, it's I wouldn't stress out about trying to determine, is this absolutely the best fingering. But what I would say in terms of trusting your hands is, and again, especially once you get past that very initial stage of everything maybe feeling new and awkward and uncomfortable, is while sometimes an awkwardness is a sign of needing to push your technique, I would be very cautious of pain, right? That if something is causing pain, that is probably a good indication that either the fingering or the technique, something needs to change so that you're not creating pain for yourself, because that's not necessarily going to go away just by doing it more. Whereas by doing this more, you might find that you start to be able to play 1 and 4 together. Anyway, hope some of that was interesting at least. And again, as I said, if nothing else, you might check out Petite Berceuse, Hasselmann's Petite Berceuse. And I'll see you in 2 weeks' time. Cheers.